Good evening, Sanbonani, Dumelang, and welcome to the Private Property Podcast. I'm your host, Uzamantungwa Kumalo. It's the Monday edition of the Private Property Podcast. It is a new week. I do hope that you all had a really good weekend and you're all geared up for an incredible week ahead. And of course, for all things relating to property, and that's exactly what we bring you every weekday at 7 p.m., where we answer some of your burning property questions. And it doesn't matter whether you're a landlord, an investor, a developer, or a tenant, we certainly do cater to you. And as usual, I never come alone. I always bring you the best experts to help us navigate whatever issue that we're talking about this weekend, or certainly this week. You can see I'm kind of, shaving off the last bits of the weekend. And of course, this evening, we're looking at something that I think a lot of people who are interested in becoming developers are certainly going to be interested in. I think a lot of us as property investors, have small ambitions and to become property developers. And sometimes there just isn't a lot that we know about it. And, in the past 2 weeks, we've had different episodes where we look at some of the, I'll say, the do's and don'ts of property development and even financing and even the importance of, starting small. And if you're going to, for example, just build 6 to 8 units, what are some of the things you should be considering? But one aspect that we haven't quite explored is, of course, around the intellectual, property when it comes to being a property developer. And that's certainly something that we're going to be looking at. This evening, we're looking at 4 crucial intellectual property considerations for property developers. And I bring, people who are not strangers to the Private Property Podcast. Of course, the first guest is Jan-Hendrik Senekal, who's a director at Strauss, Daly Attorneys, as well as Du-Plessis, who's a partner and an IP attorney from PFT Burger Patent and Trademark. Gentlemen, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening, Zama.
Zama, thank you.
And of course, I know that we are, broadcasting from your Facebook, from your YouTube, and also to Instagram. So welcome to the Instagram viewers. I know last week there was a nice battle between Facebook and Instagram. We'd certainly love to see how that's going to go this evening. And of course, welcome to the Instagram, for viewers at home. We are with you every weekday at 7 p.m. I know some of the Facebook viewers are always saying, well, we've been here since day one. We know how this goes. If anything, they're more than happy to give you a tour of how things are done here on the Private Property Podcast. But of course, let's get to this evening's conversation. I'm a bit of a nerd, so even though you love property, you love various aspects of property, I love knowing, some of the technical things when it comes to property, from the legal aspect to if you're building something, wanting to understand things like, what's the cement composition, how is cement being done? So I really have a massive nerdgasm every time I'm able to have those kinds of conversations. And just even before this, we came on live, we're actually having a conversation with my 2 guests, which is quite interesting. So we're quite excited to bring you this one. And I want to just start with you, Andre, because I think when people hear intellectual property, they probably get, so confused and probably think they know what they're talking about or they don't know what they're talking about. Sometimes people, confuse it or think it's only about copyright and trademark and design. And even there, they don't quite know what it all means. Perhaps sort of give us a nice sort of breakdown of what exactly we mean when we talk about, intellectual property, before we even look at intellectual property and how it could relate to, property developers.
Thank you, Zama, and welcome to all the listeners. I hope our talk this evening will be interesting to all of them. Zama, I think just before we start, we just need to distinguish between intellectual property law and property law. There's a lot of people, as I told you, when I tell them I do intellectual property law, they hear the property law and then they think I sell houses, where property law relates to the owning of a house or a piece of land or a vehicle for that matter, where intellectual property is an intangible asset, an asset nonetheless, something that has real value in it. And I think before Jan-Hendrik discusses the practical implications, we just need to tell the listeners the different types of intellectual property protection that we can get and what the differences are between all of these different protections. So the first one is a trademark. A trademark is something that indicates the origin of a product or a service. If I, for example, if I buy a can of Coke, I see the red can of Coke, I recognize the name, I recognize the label, and I know exactly where that product comes from. Same for any type of service or product that you can find for that matter. So if I drive down the highway, all that I see around me, all these billboards, all these advertisements is trademark. So I know exactly where that specific product or service comes from. Now, trademark in South Africa is done or classified through the NIS classification, which divides trademarks into 45 classes. Classes 1 to 34 are the so-called goods classes, and 35 to 45 are the so-called service classes. So, for example, medicine is class 5, clothing is class 25, legal services is class 45. So everything you see or do has its own product. So if I need a trademark, I will identify my appropriate class and I will file in that class. So that's a trademark in a nutshell. Copyright is a little bit different than other forms of intellectual property in South Africa in the sense that you don't need registration. If you comply with the requirements, you have automatic copyright protection. So there are two subsets of requirements. The first one relates to the work itself, and the second subset relates to the author, with the first set of requirements being it must be an original work, meaning it must be my own time, effort, and skill in creating that work, and it must be in material form, printed on a copy disk, on a computer disk, on a screen. If I comply with those sets, I comply with that first subset of requirements. The second one is the author must be a South African resident, or it must first have been published in a Berne Convention country. Now, Berne Convention is a very old convention where I think the last time I heard, 179 countries in the world is part of this. So if I comply with all of these requirements, I have automatic copyright protection in various forms as per the Copyright Act, artistic works, literary works, published editions, photographs, so anything that is a work. So there are many types of works that I won't bore the user, the listeners of going into. Now we move on to patents. So patents is when I have this idea. I can't protect my idea, but this idea, it goes into a piece of technology. I create this technology. So how do I protect this technology? Through a patent. If it is novel and inventive, meaning there must be nothing like that in the world, and it must not be in natural progression of existing technology. So if I have comply with that, I can get a patent and I can enforce my patent or my technology. If we move to a design, we get two types of designs. We get an aesthetic design and we get a functional design. So a design protects the shape of my idea. So the two different types of design we get. So functional is this product or invention of mine looks the way it looks because of the function that it has. Or an aesthetic design is it looks the way it looks because it looks nice. It's pleasing to the eye. So in short, those are the forms of intellectual property protection that anyone has to their disposal. If I want to protect my business or I want to protect my goods or my services that I have, and that I wish to distinguish myself from anyone else in the market. So if I deliver a service that is proprietary information, proprietary technology, firstly, I will have my trademark so that everyone knows this product or service comes from me, and I will protect it through a patent so that only I can use it, only I have that access to that technology, or I can license someone to use that technology and I can generate an additional stream of income. So in short, in a nutshell, those are the different forms of intellectual property protection we have in South Africa.
And, Andrea, actually, I'm going to come back to you because I certainly want to get a sense of perhaps some of the more interesting, I'll say, conflicts that you've come across when it comes to, people not protecting their IP well enough. Because oftentimes, I think when you look at, for example, entrepreneurs, they sometimes will say, I want to first protect my IP before actually launching. Other people are like, just launch. You'll deal with some of that other stuff later. But before we get there, I actually want to bring in Jan-Hendrik here because, of course, we are the Private Property Podcast, and a lot of people have an interest, particularly in property. So they've certainly heard the breakdown from Andre in terms of what we mean often when we speak about intellectual property in the South African context. Perhaps then take us through, we'll say the protections that relates particularly to property developers, because I'm sure people at home are thinking, okay, I'm still not quite getting a sense of how this then relates to property developers.
Yeah, it's very interesting, Zama, because like we said offline, for your normal property owner that owns his own home or apartment, there's almost zero intellectual property that's going to apply to that property in that form of ownership. But when we move into the development space, there's quite a few considerations which are quite important for development. And obviously, like things go, the larger the development is, the more important these things become. And that's where, except for something like copyright that Andre mentions, you can get it automatically. It's important that developers realize that first step needs to be taken. You need to take action to own that right or the ownership of your intellectual property. Like when you're purchasing property, you're going to go through the transaction and you're going to pay a certain amount of fees or price for the property. Whereas intellectual property, you're also going to pay a fee to register a trademark, to register a patent, and these kind of things. So from a property and property development perspective, there's really copyright will apply, and I'm going to let Andre just deal with how and when that will apply. And then one of the important applications will also be that a trademark will apply. That'll be mostly when developers developing an estate or some kind of property, very big building. Let's give somebody some free advertising. We've got a big development up the north coast in KZN of Durban. It was a Daly estate, for example. It's very well known, and I've worked with them personally. And they actually have a number of trademarks under their brand. They've got Daly, the normal trademark in hotels and lakes, and a few. But they've protected all of these brands, which is very important because obviously then it gives you the right to stop somebody when they are going to try and knock off your brand. Develop something that is, let's say, there's a Zambali cash and carry or whatever. And I think Andre will also just delve into that a little bit more when trademarks kind of get watered down a little bit.
And one of the things that I actually want to explore, but we're going to take a quick break. And Andre mentioned this, that, one of the other, I'd say, areas when it comes to intellectual property is around design. I mean, I'm certainly interested to also find out if that's something that comes into play when you look at property developers. I mean, I know, for example, that a lot of them, with some of the property developers, you already know which developer is building a particular, complex or estate just based on how it aesthetically looks. And you'll typically find that other estates won't necessarily copy that. That could be almost a signature look. So I'd be interested to know if that's also something that's perhaps protected, or it's just an aesthetic decision and other developers don't go sort of copying that because they don't want people then thinking it's their competitors building that or complex or estate that they're essentially building. We're going to go for a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to take your questions and comments. If you are an aspiring property developer, what have been some legal issues that you've probably, struggled with, especially when it comes to intellectual property? Because I think this is one of those areas that we probably don't spend sufficient time exploring and understanding. And a bit later after the break, I also want to then look at at which stage is it best as an aspiring property developer, or when you already have the capital to go into property development, should you be looking at those intellectual property, making sure that you essentially secure your intellectual property, because I think sometimes perhaps you're thinking the protections are too expensive. You'll do it later once you have, a bit of cash flow, once it makes, financial sense. But I want to get a sense from my guests this evening around, when is it actually better to already start thinking about your IP protection as a property developer? We're going to go for a quick break and we'll be back just after this. Welcome back to episode 125 of the Private Property Podcast. I'm your host, Zama. It's a Monday edition of the Private Property Podcast, and as usual, we've got expert guests that are helping us navigate our property journeys. It doesn't matter whether you're a tenant, a landlord, a developer, or certainly looking to invest. And this evening, we're looking at 4 crucial intellectual property considerations for property developers. And, in the first bit of our conversation, we essentially looked at the 4 different types of, intellectual property that we essentially have in South Africa, and a nice breakdown of what they essentially, what they capture, and I think the various ways that would typically apply. And that's something that, Andre took us through, which is such an important thing, because I think sometimes we get confused, as he was saying, that sometimes when people hear that he's doing intellectual property, they think that he actually does property law, when in effect it's actually 2 very completely different things. But I want us to continue looking at then when it applies to particularly property developers. And Jan-Hendrik was giving us a nice breakdown there of some of the big developers that would typically, make sure that they have their IP protections almost from the get-go, because they know that they're going to have large-scale operations, whether in a particular, city or even across the country. And that's something that's very important for them to be able to make sure that they, somebody else can't go trading, under their name, and that their IP is adequately protected. Now, Andre, Jan-Hendrik was saying that you delve a little deeper around in which instance, copyright and perhaps even trademark would come into effect when it comes to your property developers.
Yeah, Zama also asked the question of any budding entrepreneurs, when is the best time for them to protect their intellectual property? For example, like in a estate, I've got this idea, I've got this estate. So the best time to protect your intellectual property is yesterday. The quicker that you can do it, the better you can do it. A good example why it is so important to protect your intellectual property when it comes to estates, and as Jan-Hendrik provided the example of Zimbabwe, is Zimbabwe will be registered as a trademark. Now, what sometimes happens is, especially in an estate or a big estate, is the area around the estate will become known under that name. For example, Zimbabwe. So Zimbabwe is this estate that we all know, but now all of a sudden around the perimeter, Zimbabwe hardware will open, or Zimbabwe tuck shop, or Zimbabwe dry cleaners. Now they are associating themselves with this estate. And if I want to move to Zimbabwe and I see, yes, but they've got a dry cleaners just at the just at the gate. It must be associated with the estate, and if the estate is so upmarket, then my dry cleaner should also be upmarket, and while they charge a premium, now I take my dry cleaning there and it comes back full of holes and it is not done properly. And that's why it's so important for the developers and for the trustees that will be running the estate to be so aware and sensitive of the intellectual property. Now, the rule especially with trademarks is, if I don't use my trademark, or if I don't use it properly, I am going to lose it eventually. Where a trademark becomes generic, I can also stand to possibly lose it. A very good example is, for example, Tupperware. I know everyone at their homes, if it's a plastic
container, we all just call it Tupperware.
Yeah. Everyone calls it Tupperware, and it's not Tupperware. And Tupperware is actually a very valuable trademark.
Yeah.
Same goes to aspirin, elevator, Hoover. All of these trademarks have become so generic that they've actually lost their value. In some instances, the trademark proprietors have lost their registered trademarks. So it is so important for the developers and for the subsequent trustees to be aware of the rights that they have and to enforce those rights. The only value in those rights is that I have the tool available to me to enforce those rights, to make sure only that area is known as Zimbali. Any services or products not associated with me will not have the name Zimbali in it, for as far as possible. So as soon as possible, get the protection in place, even if it does cost a couple of rand to do that. The amount that you stand to lose later on down the road, and there's much more that you stand to lose than the capital that you have to invest to do it. And if you build a trademark portfolio step by step, it is very cost effective to do something like this, as and when you add services. Now, a lot of entrepreneurs will say, but is it necessary for me to register a trademark now? Can I maybe use my trademark? Or let's say I've got this development. Is it necessary to register it now? So yes and no. So it is much better to have a registered trademark, which is an asset like a property or land or a house. But if I use a trademark, I accrue what they call common law rights. I get a common law trademark. So I get a certain reputation that accrues to my trademark that I can possibly use to enforce my rights. But it's a much bigger hurdle to overcome than when I have a registered trademark. Now, when it comes to copyright, that's more applicable with the developers and the architects, because the architects will draw up a sketch, which the developers will then use and build. So again, it's something I can keep you busy with for the next 6 hours, but the gist of it is the first author of any work is also the first copyright holder, where you get two instances where the architect will be an employee of the developer. So if it's employee and it's under a contract of service, that the copyright will immediately be assigned to the employer. But where the architect is maybe from an outside firm, the developer needs to make sure that the proper assignments are in the contract with the architect, so that even though the architects are the first author, that the copyright in those sketches are assigned to the developer for future use or whatever they might wish to do in the future.
So just before the break there, Andre, I asked the question, one of the questions that I also asked was around whether, you're able to have any IP protections when it comes to the design of a building. We actually got a comment here from one of our Instagram viewers, Umo Mongezi, who says, it's called precedent study in architecture when designs look similar and it is acceptable. However, it becomes an illegal act when the design is replicated without the architect or the client's consent. Another comment here from BP Mods is the similar thing I've seen happen when Menlyn Main in Pretoria, where the developers created the Menlyn Main precinct and every business outside of close to the precinct leveraged off that name. That's a comment there around the Zimbali example, which I've also seen. I think with Menlyn, everything is now kind of has that same or similar name that you think is associated with the developers. Before we even look at the cost factor, perhaps Jan-Hendrik, you can take us through whether we are able. I mean, I know that Momong is here, already gave us a comment around this, but are we able to, have any IP protections when it comes to design?
It's a quite an interesting question, and I think the analogy that is drawn there with reference to design from an architecture and a design perspective is probably to the designs as they see it as an architect, and what Andre mentioned when he talks about designs from an intellectual property perspective is a slightly different animal, so to speak, which applies to the design that he spoke about applies to inventions. So the functional part of an invention to make it look aesthetically pleasing, like he said, or it looks a certain way because it performs a certain function, which isn't really applicable to the design of, let's say, a certain house or structure in an estate. But when an architect is going to do a design, which there's going to be building plans and normal drawings, and possibly most of the time will be renders, quite a few renders, especially when you're dealing with large building designs and the way that that's going to look. All of that will have copyright in it. And then it becomes important, especially for large developments, that the developer ensures that he has contracts that assign the rights and ownership of that copyright to the developer. For whatever reason they might want to exploit it, it should belong to them. Otherwise, it in fact belongs to somebody else, which might be the architect or whichever designer you used.
We've got another question here, this time from one of our Facebook viewers. I'll give that one to you, Andre, and it's coming from Sammy Mahlatse, who asks, how much does it cost to do trademark a name, or to do trademark or for a name or a product?
Zama, that unfortunately that question is about how long is a piece of string. It all depends on what the services are, what the goods are, how the trademark looks, how the trademark is used. Is it a trademark comprising of a picture and a word? How is it used? Are they always used together? Are they used separately? What are they used for? In any situation like that, I would suggest approach an IP attorney. He's welcome to give me an email. He's more than welcome to do that. And we can then have a look at it. Every matter is judged separately, as you mentioned before off air. Every matter has its own facts, has its own issues. So in a situation like that, I would suggest approach a trademark attorney, get a cost estimate, and also not all attorneys are equal. So some attorneys might ask a little bit more, some might ask a little bit less. Depends on, does he want a trademark search to be done? Does he just want to file? So it all depends on what the facts are and what he is actually using it for. So he might use it for one trade, one class, for example, clothing in class 25. Or you might provide clothing services, he might provide customization services, he might provide leather clothing, he might provide clothing, he might provide a whole range of things. So it will all depend on what he is actually using it for and how he is using it.
Yeah, gentlemen, before I let you go, I'm going to wrap up with, final tips from both of you when it comes to, viewers at home who are aspiring to be property developers, and what kind of protections they should be prioritizing at the very beginning. So before they even sort of break ground in their various, estates or complexes or wherever the plots are where they're going to be building. Jan-Hendrik, I'll start with you. Any tips for the budding property developer?
Thank you, Zama. I think the most important thing that stands out, we got the example tonight of the trademark. Every property developer that I work with usually start quite early looking at names. And it's a quite interesting aspect when they start to throw around names of what the development or the building or the estate will look like. Once you start searching, you find that actually, a lot of names are already used somewhere else. So the tip number one would be get in touch with an IP attorney. Start searching that name that you're interested in. If it's available, register it, like Andre said yesterday. Because I think a very important part of that is that, like your podcast is around property, and that's brick and mortar property, but now we're talking intellectual property, but it's also a form of property. And that form of property also accumulates in value like brick and mortar property does. Slightly differently and calculated slightly differently, but you still want value in it, and you start getting value once you register it. So I would say that's tips number 1 and 2.
Okay. And Andre, any final tips for our budding property developers?
Yes, absolutely. And to add on what Jan-Hendrik said now, be aware of what your intellectual property is. Keep an updated schedule. Make sure that I know these are my trademarks, this is what I've got, and enforce those rights. If you have a registered trademark, or have a trademark and you don't enforce it, then there's actually no value in it. Also, make sure if there's any agreements where you ask someone to create a work for you, being it an architect's sketch or a software program or an app or whatever it might be, make sure that the appropriate assignment clauses are in those agreements, so that there's no issues later on who is the owner, who is the copyright holder of this specific work. But most importantly, enforce those rights.
I'm going to, I think Sammy just posted actually another question here quickly before I let both of you go. And he asks, is there any website where I can go and get information about this trademark so we know what is required to start the process? Absolutely.
Zama, if I can give you our firm's website where all the information can be found. It's www.burgerip, so burger like the burger you eat, IP for intellectual property, .co.za. All the information relating to trademarks, patents, designs, copyright, even the commercial aspects of the intellectual property can be found there.
Well, Sammy, there you have it. That's burgerip.co.za. If you want to find out more about, the IP protections that are available to you. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It has been a pleasure to have you on the Private Property Podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
It's been great.
And that was Jan-Hendrik Senekal, who's a director at Strauss Attorneys, as well as Andre Du-Plessis, who's a partner and IP attorney from PFT Burger Patent and Trademark. Well, that brings us to the end of the Monday edition of the Private Property Podcast. It certainly has been a pleasure to be back on your screens. And of course, as usual, I'm back again tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. And we keep the conversation going on our social media platforms. I saw today we didn't have the wars of the social media platforms. It's great to hear from both our both our Instagram and Facebook viewers at home. I think next time we're probably going to take a nice jab at the YouTube viewers so that they also get onto the party. That's it from me, Zama. We're back again on your screens tomorrow. And as usual, hoping you're staying home and staying safe.
Hi, I'm Cornita Bobs. I'm a BCom student at Stellenbosch University. I currently live in Valkevonen Estate and I absolutely love this area. Historically, Stellenbosch is known as a student town. It offers an incredibly peaceful lifestyle, and the people around town are always welcoming and friendly. Because it's a small town, there's an amazing community vibe with some really authentic coffee shops and restaurants. The trees along Victoria Street create a beautiful environment to be in, and it's really cool for students passing through campus. There's some excellent boys and girls schools in the area. Our town has such a rich history, but at the same time it's really modern, and you'll find some amazing art installations all around. The sunrises and sunsets are some of the best in the world. It's the most beautiful place to call home. I've lived here for the past 5 years, and it's been an unforgettable experience. And this is my neighborhood.